And here we are in part two for chapter 12. So, how do we go about correcting for wage discrimination? Well, age. Okay, I keep talking about age. I'm going to get to a bit of data that's going to relate to that in a nice way, and I can't overemphasize the obvious. Okay, because if you're looking at two groups and one is younger than the other, well, you would expect their earnings to be lower because they have less work experience, probably less investment in human capital. Right. So again, just don't look at the sound bites. The sound bites are garbage. Correct for the things that are objective, and then see what are the obstacles that, from a public policy standpoint, we really want to overcome. Okay, education. Okay, education's a tough one. So I remember a very distinct story, probably 5 or 8 years ago in the LA Times. And it involved a young African American male who was his class valedictorian, went to a high school in the inner city in LA, got a full ride to UCLA, and struggled in school. So the question is why? Educational opportunities that he had in high school were not equivalent. So even when you look and say, someone went to high school, someone graduated from college, are they getting the same kind of opportunities for education and to enrich their human capital that people living in different neighborhoods would get? Okay. It's a tough one. It's one we would want to correct for. The obvious one, differences in education is a no-brainer. But, what if you go to a college that historically, let's say, was a black college, and you end up really not getting the same access to resources as you would, and none of us can, if we don't get into like an Ivy League school. Okay. Differences in experience, work experience, obviously very important to differences in earnings. Differences in hours worked. Okay. It varies quite a bit, and certain occupations, people work an awful lot of hours. Doctors, lawyers, they make good money. They also work 40 hours with the exception that proves the rule. Okay. Obviously, to the extent that certain groups are not well represented in high-paying occupations, then that's going to come into play. The size of firms is believed to make a difference. You'd expect larger firms probably to engage in less segregation or less discrimination because they would be more open to lawsuits. Why, you may ask? Really simple. Certain lawyers develop the reputation for being able to effectively sue certain companies. So I do defense cases for certain large companies, and the plaintiff lawyers sue them all the time because they know the ins and outs. They know the Achilles heel, perhaps. They know how to go after them. They know the corporate culture. They might know anything that's unique to that particular firm and try and exploit that. Okay. One that you probably don't think about but makes maybe a ton of difference would be location, because the distribution of different ethnic groups, racial groups in the United States is anything but evenly distributed. If, for example, blacks are more heavily represented in the southern part of the United States, wages in the South are lower than in the West, for example, by quite a bit for everybody. So if people are working in areas of the country where wages tend to be low, then their earnings are going to be low, even without any discrimination. And in fact, but you say, something's going on there. That whole region is being discriminated against. Hold on. The difference in the cost of living needs to be taken into account as well. So you could be earning less money in certain regions of the country, but actually have more spending power than you would in areas that could pay you more. I'm the perfect example of that, because when I moved from upstate New York and took a full-time job at CSUN back in the 1980s, my earnings went up. I'm trying to think how much. I think about 10% over what I was making in upstate New York. And the difference in my rent, moving from a 2-bedroom to a 1-bedroom apartment in the Valley, more than ate up the higher earnings. besides dealing with higher insurance rates and more expensive labor-intensive items because labor costs are higher than they were in upstate. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the differences that we find. Okay, ethnicity. Okay, so these are differences in earnings based upon ancestry. There's very wide disparity depending upon different groups. Differences in age between certain groups. Okay, again, I keep bringing up age. We will get to the punchline on that in a little bit. Differences in education, language barriers, particularly if you've got an ethnic group that tends to be more recently represented in the United States. You're going to have language barriers that are going to impact on earnings. Again, they have absolutely nothing to do with discrimination, but it's narrowing the number of jobs that are available because you'd have to have a certain facility with the language in some of those jobs. Hispanic earnings, in measuring that becomes quite difficult because you've got Hispanic individuals of many different backgrounds. So lumping everyone together under that heading may not be very useful. Okay? There's a book, the best book applied to economics I've ever read is a book called Ethnic America. It came out like 1980. It's old. Okay, I think he may have written a book that kind of updates that. It was written by an economist by the name of Thomas Sowell, Sowell. He's like 90 years old now, so he finally retired, but very prolific writer and somewhat controversial economist, but interesting scholar. Right? The book is fascinating, and it's fascinating because it tells the story of all sorts of different groups that came to the United States. Right? And you may not know that, for example, Blacks who came from the Caribbean tend to have very high earnings, and many times higher earnings than whites, as opposed to Blacks who came from other parts of the world. Right? And in the book, he really gets into explaining why people ended up doing what they did. And it's everything from where they ended up moving to, which we've already discussed, to we discussed that in the migration chapter, but also to understand the kinds of jobs that people had, which then led to differences in earnings, okay? So for example, Jewish Americans back in Europe were not allowed to be landowners. So you're not going to find farmers coming to the United States, okay? Those would be different ethnic groups. They were not only not allowed to be landowners, other kind of property restrictions. A lot of them became very skilled in certain kinds of trades, obviously as merchants and in skilled professions, law, medicine, things of that nature. The Irish were very heavily represented when they came to the United States in government and law enforcement. Okay? And there's some interesting theories about that. So a lot of politicians, if we go back and look like 1800s, early 1900s, in the eastern part and midwestern part of the United States, a lot of them were Irish politicians, Boston being the obvious example, New York would be another example of that, and a lot of police officers were Irish, right? Why so? Because in Ireland, they were under the political control of the British. And so when they came here, they had the newfound freedom to be enforcing the law and making the law, which they were not allowed to do back there. And so I give you that's a couple examples of many examples to understand how people ended up doing what they did here in the United States is related to the ethnic background and the experience that they had, okay? If we adjust for differences in productivity based on ethnicity and language proficiency, the gap in earnings is more like maybe 5% or so. Right? So it's not as great. Okay. Next thing that I want to share with you is some data. And the data it's a little bit old, but it's not so old that it's not useful. Okay. For the United States, I've got some data from the year 2000 And for Canada, I've got some data for 2001. Okay, let's start with the United States. And so the data that I pulled is, and like I said, these differences may be even more pronounced now, but it's going to prove the point. I looked at the median age of whites, blacks, Asians, and Hispanics. Okay? And this is what we found as of the year 2000 based on the census. The median age of whites was 37.7 years. The next youngest out of the four categories we're looking at here were Asians, 32.7 years of age, 5 years younger. Before we have a discussion about anything, the older group will have had more years of work experience. We'd expect earnings to be higher. Okay, blacks, age median 30.2. That's 7.5 years. That's 20% younger than the whites. So again, less experience, less education, because more of them may not have even been through obtaining education, and that alone would predict lower earnings. And then Hispanics, of any background, Hispanics, the median age in the year 2000 was 25.8. That's almost 12 years below the median age of whites. In other words, that whites, the median, were about 50% older than Hispanics. So you've got a lot of young people, young families, large families, and again, just in terms of education and experience, is going to be a noted difference. Okay. Now, how about the data from Canada from 2001, and why Canada? Because this is very different kind of data, and I find it really interesting because it doesn't deal with the color of your skin or your ethnic background so much. It deals with religion, and I think it's kind of interesting. So here it is. For all of Canada in 2001, the median age was 37. That's actually a little older than the United States, but not tremendously so. Okay, we're going to go from oldest to youngest once again. Ukrainian Orthodox, median age 46, much higher than for all of Canada, 37. And so again, we would expect their earnings are going to be higher. Okay. Protestants and Jews both come in at a median age of 42. Older than the average in Canada, you'd expect their earnings, for no other reason, to be higher. Okay. Hindus, median age 32. 5 years younger than the median for all of Canada, and 10 or more years younger than the other groups that we talked about. And finally, Muslims, in Canada, 2001, the median age was 28. When you hear a report about differences in earnings amongst different groups, different people, different genders, does anyone bring any of these issues up? Of course they don't, right? And that's why in economics, we're not here to talk about emotions. We're not here to do anything but analyze objectively what explains people's experience and why, to a large extent, discrimination in a competitive economy is so costly. We would expect to see less of it, but it still persists. And we want to understand as economists why it does. Okay, we'll pick this up in part 3.